Our first workshop will be presented by Jenn Schilling. Jenn Schilling is a senior research analyst at the University of Arizona, a data science mentor at RStudio, an adjunct faculty member at the College for Creative Studies, and the founder of Schilling Data Studio, a data visualization training and consulting agency. With this in mind, Jenn will present the following workshop, Dashboard Design Thinking.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to share my workshop, Dashboard Design Thinking. All right, so welcome. I am so happy that you're here. And in this workshop, I'm going to talk about design thinking and how it connects to creating dashboards. At the University of Arizona, we've used design thinking to create user-centric dashboards that empower our stakeholders and make effective decisions. And we're going to be using a couple polls throughout this session. So I will put those in the, I'll put a link to those in the chat as we go along. So I'm Jenn Schilling, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so glad that you're here today. I have a decade of experience in data science, and I'm currently a senior research analyst at the University of Arizona in the Department of University Analytics and Institutional Research. As Vera mentioned, I also serve as an adjunct faculty member at the College for Creative Studies, where I teach graduate classes on data visualization. And I also recently started my own company, Schilling Data Studio, focused on creating impactful data visualization and data visualizations training. I have additional experience as a middle school teacher, a data visualization consultant, an operations research engineer in the supply chain, and a statistician in advertising and market research. I really love data visualization and design, so I'm super excited to get to talk to you about dashboard design thinking today. Thank you so much for being here. After today's presentation, you'll be able to explain the 6 steps of design thinking, relate design thinking to dashboard design, provide examples of dashboard design thinking, and apply design thinking to your next dashboard project. So the rest of this workshop will flow through these 3 outcomes. First, I'll define design thinking and explain each step. I'll spend most of our time together detailing each step of the design thinking process in relation to dashboard design. And then I'll share some examples of dashboard design thinking from the University of Arizona. As I mentioned, there'll be a few polls throughout this session, which I'll share using a tool called Mentimeter. And all you'll need to do for the polls is to keep an eye on the chat for the link and then open that link in the web browser. So let's get started. First, let's define design thinking. Design thinking is an ideology and process for solving complex problems in a user-centric way, ensuring great experiences and outcomes for the user. The 6 phases of design thinking, according to the Nielsen-Norman group, are to empathize with your users to understand them, define your users' needs, their problems, and your insights, ideate by challenging assumptions and brainstorming ideas for creative solutions, prototype to start creating solutions and understand what parts of your ideas work, test solutions by returning to your users for feedback and making sure your solution meets their needs, and then implementing the final solution and communicating the final product. So the empathize and define steps help us understand the problem. The ideate and prototype steps help us explore solutions, and the test and implement steps help us materialize the final product. So now we come to my very first poll. Let me just switch to my correct screen here, and then I'll share the link with you. All right, here we go. Here's the link in the chat, and I'm just going to switch to the other screen that I have here. And I'd like to know, what's your experience with design thinking? Is it something you've heard of before? Is it something you've used before? Or is it something completely new to you? And any of these answers are totally fine for today's presentation. I just wanted to get an idea of where people were. Awesome, I'm seeing poll results come in, thank you. All right, so we're still shifting a little bit, but it looks like about half of us. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see the poll. Let me put the link in the chat again here. Hopefully that'll come up for you now. But it looks like for about half the people, a little more than half, design thinking is new to you. And about 1/3 of people have heard of design thinking before. And few people have used design thinking before too. So this is awesome. I'm hoping, even for those of you who've used it before or heard of it before, I'm really hoping that this will be valuable for you. I think it will be. And for those of you who it's new to, this should be really, really helpful. And I'll go through all of the different steps. So thank you so much for answering my poll. As I said, we'll have a few more of those going through. So let me switch back to my slides. Okay, so we've got slides back up. All right. So why should we use design thinking? Design thinking offers value to professionals like us working in data science because it focuses on the audience to find out what they want and need to enhance their data-informed decision-making. And design thinking is also beneficial because it is so user-centered. It starts with the collection of information from and understanding the user and their needs, and then it ends with testing the solution with the user to get feedback. So it's all about the user all the way through. And it also encourages innovation and collaboration since it involves exploring multiple options for the same problem. So I think it is a really useful and powerful tool for data science itself, especially as with data science, we are, or at least for me in data science, what I'm trying to do, I guess I shouldn't speak for all of us necessarily, but for me, what I'm trying to do with data science is help people make better decisions with data. And people are a key part of that as well as the data. And so design thinking helps me think about the users and incorporate them into my planning and my project process. And so I'm going to be focused specifically on how we build dashboards with design thinking, but design thinking can apply across many different types of data science applications. So now let's talk about how design thinking relates to creating dashboards. Incorporating the principles of design thinking can help provide a method for dealing with ambiguous and complex problems like designing and building a dashboard. And human-centered design also helps to ensure that the resulting insights are actionable and valuable for stakeholders who remain at the core of the process of design thinking. The power of this method is that it provides a gradual step-by-step framework to get from a problem space with many unknowns to a well-defined solution. So now we're going to talk about each of the steps briefly, and then in the next following slides, I'm going to go into more depth in each step. So first step is to empathize. So this is taking time to understand our users, what questions they're trying to answer with data, what goals they have, and what frustrations burden them. The next step is to define. So this is about doing your homework or user research. We do this to help identify and define the core problems that our users have in using and accessing data. During the third step, we challenge our assumptions and create ideas. And the goal is kind of to brainstorm all possible solutions before committing ourselves to one. So we want to look for alternative ways to view the problem and identify solutions. And brainstorming and mind mapping can be critical parts of this ideate step. Rapid prototyping then provides the opportunity for us to get feedback from users about our solution. And this is our opportunity to experiment with solutions. Then we test and try out our solutions and evaluate the results. We'll return to our users for feedback on the solution. And then finally, we put our vision into effect through implementation. But it's important to realize that the process does not necessarily end here at the implementation step. We're going to continue to return to our users to evaluate and refine our solutions. And communication is another part of the implementation step because we have to share the dashboard that we create with our users and explain the different use cases. Another thing to note is that these steps are not always sequential. They're often repeated in an iterative fashion, meaning that you could go empathize, define, ideate, and then when you're brainstorming, you might realize that you need to go back and define the problem a little more clearly. Or when you're prototyping, maybe none of the ideas really pan out, so you go back to the ideate stage to brainstorm. And especially with this prototype and test feedback loop, there's a lot of iteration and we're going back and forth there to try and go back to the users and really understand, is this solution working for them? What ideas do they have for improvement and all of that? So next, we're going to go through each stage in a little bit more detail. So the goal of the empathize step, as I've said, is to understand the audience, the use cases, and the purpose of the dashboard. One way to do this is through something called empathy mapping. And this could be done with an internal project team or by speaking with individual users. So you could either do this, brainstorming with the group of people who are working on the project, or by interviewing the end users of the dashboard. And the goal is to embody or capture what the user says, thinks, does, and feels. And you can consider what their goals are. So here's an example from the Nielsen Norman Group of an empathy map for a user thinking of buying a TV. So they are doing different things as they are trying to think about buying a TV. They're saying, what's the best solution? Or what's the best TV for me? They are thinking, why are there so many options? Something they're doing is maybe they're looking online and researching different options, and maybe they're feeling a little bit confused or overwhelmed by all of the choices. And so an empathy map is a quick, digestible way to illustrate users' attitudes and behaviors. And once created, it can act as a source of truth throughout the project and protect it from biases and unfounded assumptions. And so this empathy map then can serve as a touch point as we go through the project. Every time we're going through a different stage, we can return back here and make sure that we're checking in with what our users are really needing. So to create your own empathy map, as I mentioned, you can have a brainstorming session with the team creating the dashboard and fill out each quadrant with what the user says, thinks, does, or feels about the dashboard or their current experience with the data that they want presented in the dashboard. You could also brainstorm some of their goals for the final product. And once you've completed the empathy map, you can look for themes within and across the quadrants. And you can look for gaps in your understanding that need to be addressed before you move forward. An empathy map is helpful both at the start of the project to get a better understanding of the user, and throughout the project, as I said, as this touch point to verify that the solution is meeting the user's needs. So I have another little poll here, and I am going to ask if you've ever used an empathy map before. So let me get to my right screen here, and then I will, there we go. Here's the link in the chat. And it looks like it has already popped up for some people. And this one, unfortunately, I guess I set not to show percentages, but to show numbers. But have you used an empathy map before, yes or no? All right, thank you all so much for your participation. It looks like a few people have, and most of us have not used an empathy map before. And that's totally fine. But this is just a really useful tool. And even if you don't do kind of the whole written out process, thinking about what the user's saying, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're doing currently with their data, and then what their goal is for the dashboard or for the data itself is a really useful exercise in the beginning of the design thinking process, in the beginning of a dashboarding project, to really try and understand what our users need and what their goals are. Thank you so much for participating in my poll. All right, let me go back over to my slides here. Okay. So a little bit more about empathizing. Here's just some other questions to think about as you're doing this empathy step. So who will use the dashboard? I kind of skipped that part in the last part about the empathy map, but when you're starting your empathy map, you need to know who you're talking about. So who's going to use your dashboard? That's your first question. Then understanding what is important to them and what do they want to know. Some other things to think about are, how will this dashboard save the user time? How will it make their job easier and help them find the information that they need? And then how can the dashboard be personalized or made especially meaningful and relevant to the user? When we have a dashboard that is personalized to the user, they're going to be more likely to use it. And if it's able to save them time as well, that's going to definitely benefit them. And so I think these are just some of the other things that you can think about as you're trying to do this empathize step, this first step of really understanding the user. And someone has said in the chat, collaborate with user extensively and try to understand their needs. Now I know it is called empathy mapping. Yeah, exactly. You're empathizing with your users and definitely collaborating with them extensively. That's a huge part of the design thinking. All right, I see another question came through on the chat. I'm going to save all questions to the end, but please do keep them coming. And if you put them in the Q&A part of the Zoom meeting, that'll help us keep track of the questions too. So next we're going to talk about the define step. In the define step, we create problem statements and write out the specifications of the dashboard. The goal of this step is to document the scope, timeline, and roles of the project, as well as clearly explain the goals and the problem statement. And clearly documenting and defining the problem and expected outcome of the dashboard is going to make it clear for everybody what is being worked towards in the project. So everyone, including all of the people working on the project, but also your project stakeholders, because you can share this with your users or your stakeholders, this kind of project document of what's happening. And then everybody's on the same page, which really helps as you move the project forward. So also consider what the measurements of success will be in the project. What does it look like to successfully complete the dashboard? Who determines when it's complete? Defining the measures of success and the outcomes helps keep the project on track and makes it easier for everyone to complete the work. And discussing this with the user ensures, as I said, everyone's on the same page and hopefully reduces the number of revisions that might need to be made later on. So some additional questions that can be asked during the define step are, what key pieces of information should be displayed? What questions should the dashboard answer? What trends should the dashboard show? And then you can answer some questions. So those first set of questions might be questions that you could ask your users or your stakeholders. And then these kinds of questions, the second set, are kind of more internal questions for the project team developing the dashboard. So what type of dashboard is needed? What data is available, what level of detail will be shown, and are there any specific requirements for how the data is presented? For example, does it need to be easy to email or easy to export? And the goal is to design a dashboard that will help the user be more efficient and also only include what is important and necessary. And by doing everything in this define step, you're outlining all of the stuff that you need in your dashboard. And I mentioned about like what type of dashboard is needed. So I just want to briefly talk about 4 different types of dashboards. So there's an executive dashboard, which shows the big picture. It might include high-level key performance indicators. Perhaps it might show some data over time, but it often shows a longer view of the data and kind of high-level stuff. An operational dashboard then shows exactly what's happening right now, and it will tell the user where issues are and could help track and monitor performance. A strategic dashboard shows progress towards a goal or over time, and it's used to inform decisions and show trends. It could also be used to set goals. And then an analytical dashboard provides more data and a detailed analysis, and it usually has a drill down capacity. It can help identify opportunities and problems, and it may include analytical techniques such as forecasting. So it's just a really brief overview of 4 different types of dashboards that you could be thinking about in your define step. Once you understand the problem statement and the types of data that you're going to be including, then you can kind of put in kind of narrow down what type of dashboard you want to make, and then that can help you with the design later on and help you into the ideate step, which we're going to talk about next. So based on what you've learned from the empathize and define steps, now you can generate ideas for dashboard solutions. And you want to remain open and curious in this step. The goal is to generate a broad set of ideas without any attempt to judge or evaluate them. And you want to look for alternate ways to view the problem and identify innovative solutions. The focus of the ideate step is quantity over quality. Certainly, the eventual goal is to create a high quality dashboard and solution to your problem, but the focus of the ideation step is to generate several options first and then narrow down which ideas to pursue. So the more ideas, the better in this step. It's good to set a time limit, and if you're able to do this with a group of people, have all people involved write down or draw as many ideas as they can. And the details and aesthetics don't matter at this stage. It's just to generate a lot of ideas. And once you've generated a lot of ideas, if you're doing this on your own or in a group, it's a good idea to take a break. And then after the break, return to the list of ideas. And the team might be able to identify some themes or similar ideas and group them together. And as you go through the ideas, keep in mind the empathize and define steps that you already did to consider the goals and benefits of each idea. The team should work together to determine the top few or combination of a few ideas to prototype and test. Some things to keep in mind are, what will be easy to understand and convey the message of the dashboard? How can the dashboard provide the greatest degree of understanding with the least amount of effort by the user? And that second question is a question that Steve Wexler brings up in his most recent book about creating dashboards. And one last note on ideation. Ideation can occur synchronously, like everybody in a room or a Zoom room together, or it can occur asynchronously, maybe over Slack or Teams or something like that. So you could hold a meeting together and brainstorm, or you could create a Slack channel or other sort of asynchronous channel for people to share ideas as they think of them over, say, 3 days or something like that. And then you could come together in a meeting to go through those ideas, or even maybe virtually have messages back and forth to kind of combine the ideas together. So a few things to consider as you ideate. One is to consider different layouts of the information. So do you want multiple columns on the dashboard or a single column? And how could you organize the information into different sections? Maybe there's a highlight sections with key metrics at a single point in time at the top, and then a details section with those same metrics shown over time or at a more granular level at the bottom of the dashboard. You want to put the most important information in the top left corner of your dashboard. So key indicators or other important data points, those need to go in the top left corner because that's how we usually read through a dashboard, as we start in the top left and read across. It's a good idea to start with the big picture at the top of the dashboard and then move into more detail. Also, in your brainstorming or you're kind of drawing out of ideas, you want to group related things together. So data points that are similar should be grouped together on the dashboard so it's easier for the user to understand and draw conclusions. And then you want to make sure you're using an appropriate graph for the relationship or message that you want to show, as well as the data that you're showing. So you can brainstorm all kinds of different data visualizations during the ideate stage, but just keep in mind that certain graphs work best for certain types of data or certain messages. For example, line graphs are good at showing data over time, and bar graphs are useful for comparing categories across different metrics. So my next poll here, which will be our last one before we get to the end, is about whether you've participated in an ideation session before. Give me 1 second to get the right one up here. And I see we've got a few questions coming in the chat. Thank you, or in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to taking a look at those in a little bit. So here is the link for the this poll, and it's about whether you've participated in an ideation session before. And again, I guess I didn't click the check to do percentages, so we'll have counts here. But have you participated in an ideation session before? Or brainstorming session? It might not have been called an ideation session. All right. Thank you all so much for participating. It looks like slightly more people are saying no, but quite a few people have participated in a brainstorming or ideation session before, which is great. So I think these kinds of things are really helpful as we're designing dashboards, or even with any other sort of data science project. It's really nice to have a brainstorming session to discuss different methods or approaches you might take to a problem, or different modeling techniques you might want to use. I know I'm speaking very specifically about dashboarding today, but this kind of design thinking process can be applied outside of dashboards as well. And so if you're able to, these are really great things to do. And even if you just do it by yourself, if you're working on something alone, it can still be helpful to kind of just like write out a bunch of ideas or draw out some different sketches. And then if you are able to, you can maybe share some of those with a colleague and get some of their feedback, as it might be a way to do it if it's kind of just you working on a project by yourself, if you don't kind of have a team working with you. If you have a whole team, it's great if you can get a team together. All right, thank you all so much for participating. Let me switch back over to my slides and we'll keep going through the steps. All right, and someone has put in the chat, I like stakeholders to ask specific questions that they would like the dashboard to answer. Yeah, that's an awesome question to ask people, and that can definitely help, especially I think with the kind of define step. That's a great question to ask as part of the define step. Are there specific questions you would like the dashboard to answer? And then you can help use that to define the whole scope and problem statement for that. Thank you, Alan. All right, so now let's talk about prototyping. Prototypes allow us to experiment with a few ideas from the ideation step in order to identify the best possible solution. A prototype is a quick, scaled down version of the product. The goal is to create something a little more refined than the ideate stage, but not a final, completely usable product. And through prototyping, you can weigh the impact versus the feasibility of your ideas. You can think of it as an experiment, kind of to test out a hypothesis. Your hypothesis is, I think this kind of brainstormed ideation idea, that's a good one. So I think that this idea might be a good solution to the problem. That's kind of the hypothesis. And then by prototyping it out, you can test whether that's actually going to be the case. Prototyping allows you to create space to explore and test the functionality of your ideas without committing to building out multiple iterations. It also helps find issues with the layout or structure prior to development, and it makes collaboration easier since the prototype can provide a plan for the final product. So this can be collaboration either on a team where if you're doing kind of the prototyping work, then you can pass the prototype off to somebody else to build it, or it can be collaboration with your stakeholders or maybe some of your users where you can put the prototype in front of them and ask them for feedback and talk them through some of the functionality. Again, it's not going to completely function how your final dashboard is going to function, but it's kind of a sketch and maybe a wireframe kind of outline of what's going to happen, and you can talk the user through some of the functionality. And because of this, a prototype can allow you to receive feedback from the end user as well as colleagues earlier. And so it's not like you've built out your whole final design and now you're getting feedback and there's a whole bunch of things you have to change. But the prototype is kind of a very simple version that then you can rapidly make changes to or make changes in the final design to. And again, don't worry about the prototype looking exactly like the final product. And a prototype can be made in any medium. Examples are that prototypes can be made in PowerPoint, in Word, in Excel, in Adobe, or even on paper. And so those are some tools that you can use for prototyping. I know there are also some web-based tools that people use, my brain just failed me. I'll have to come back to that. I'll try and think of those and let you all know later. The ones I had in my notes were more kind of software based, so PowerPoint and Word and Excel. But I like PowerPoint to do, Plotly, thank you. Someone put in the chat. Thank you very much. I like PowerPoint to use, or you could use something like, if you've got the Google Suites, you could use something like Google Slides or Google Sheets there. I like PowerPoint because you can insert objects easily. So you can kind of insert rectangles to represent either headers, or you can insert text boxes easily. And you can make little kind of prototype bar charts, or you can make little line charts. The ones that I'm showing on this slide here, some of those are in PowerPoint. And then again, some of them are drawn. You can also always use pen and paper and take a picture of it or scan it and things like that. That also works as well. So some things to consider in your prototype from user interface design principles. You want to organize the information to guide the user through the data. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, people usually scan horizontally across the page and then down. So you want to put the most important information in your top left. You also want to be consistent in formatting and layout with your fonts and colors to help organize the data and guide the user. And a prototype is a nice way to kind of figure out what fonts and colors you want to use as well. You want to keep it simple. Each element on your prototype and on your final dashboard should serve a purpose. You want to remove distractions from the design and leave some white space. Users want to be able to easily find the information they need. So you want to limit the number of charts and data points on the dashboard to avoid clutter and draw attention to your key metrics. If you have too much on there, people aren't going to know what to focus on. And this whole process of the design thinking helps you narrow down to what you actually really need on the dashboard. And then make chart choices based on data visualization best practices, which we don't have time to get into today. But there are certainly, charts that are better for certain data types and for certain messages. You can provide visual cues to help the user navigate the dashboard. So this can be done by including clear titles and labels and by using the appropriate chart type. And then you can also use color as a visual cue to highlight important information. And then if you add context on your dashboard, like little text boxes with explanations and things like that, that can provide additional information that the user might need to interpret the data. So you can think about those visual cues and where you would place them and what you might say in those different things as you are going through your prototype. And finally, the last guideline here is to get color right by making sure that it's consistent. So if you're using a certain color to highlight information, you want to use that same color for your highlight color throughout your dashboard. If you're using a certain color for a specific category and you have that category elsewhere on the dashboard, you want to make sure you're using the same color for the same categories. So making sure that your color is consistent. And also it's important to try and limit the use of color so that it's easier for the user to understand and interpret. You don't have to use a color legend on every single one of your graphs. Really try and use it only when you need to. Sometimes you can use labels on a bar graph and have each bar labeled instead of having each bar a different color, for example. So once you've developed a few prototypes based on your key data points, your graphs, and your audience and goal, the next step is to test it out by getting feedback on the prototype. And you want to think back to your use cases for the dashboard. Does the prototype meet the needs of the users? And go back to your project brief that you made in your define step and your empathy map and ask if the prototype fulfills the user's requirements. And in this step, you could do it with your users and your stakeholders, or this is something that you can also do if you don't have access to your users. This is something that you can do on your own by thinking about your users and by going back to your empathy map and then just looking again at your prototypes and asking yourself these questions. And then once you've done some testing, you can revise your prototype based on this feedback and consider how you can make your dashboard more personalized and show the user what's really relevant to them. And maybe it could be made simpler too. Could you simplify anything to make it a little bit easier to navigate? This test step is very collaborative and iterative. And after making changes based on feedback, you can always go back to the users again to find out if the updated prototype better meets their needs. And during this stage, you also want to make sure that the prototype will work across multiple devices and also meet accessibility requirements. So that's another thing that you can think of and think about in this test step. So here's some guidelines for conducting prototype tests from the Interaction Design Foundation. One is to compare alternatives. So if it's possible to do this, you can let users compare multiple prototypes and tell you what they prefer and don't prefer about each one. Again, if possible, you can let the user experience the prototype. So if you have something that they can take a look at on their own before the session, that might be a way to do it. Maybe you have a prototype that works a little bit and has a little bit of interactivity, and then they can kind of interact with it a little bit. The idea here is to try not to over explain how it works or how it solves the problem. I think that key one is how it solves the problem. You don't want to over explain that. You want the user to experience the prototype and tell you how they're reacting to it and how it is solving the problem for them, rather than you telling them how it's solving the problem. That's the way to get the best feedback from them. You can also ask users to explain their experience exploring the prototype. You can ask, what are you thinking right now as you're doing this or as you're looking at this? And you can observe how they're using it or how they're interacting with the prototype. Are they using it how you intended or not? So are they navigating, again, it's not something necessarily that they can click around on and filter, but are they reading through it and noticing the things that you intended for them to notice first? Did they miss a section of the dashboard? If they make a mistake or misinterpret something, that's really valuable feedback for how the prototype can be improved. And then you can ask follow-up questions like, what did you mean when you said da, 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 or like, how did this make you feel and why? And this can really help you understand what their experience is in interacting with the dashboard and how you could make it better. And Steve Wexler proposes this question in his book, The Big Picture. I mentioned it earlier. How can the dashboard provide the greatest degree of understanding with the least amount of effort by the user? And so as I said, I mentioned this during the Ideate stage, but I think it's also a useful question to revisit during the testing stage. And again, this might not be a question that you're going to ask directly to your users, but in asking them some questions about your prototype and having them give you some feedback, you can understand how much effort they're having to put in to understand and interact with the dashboard. And the final stage is to implement the best possible solution. So based on your prototyping and testing, you can determine the final design to move forward with. And remember to think back to the empathize and define steps. Consider the user again and the message, as well as the goal of the dashboard and what it's trying to convey. Did your dashboard achieve that goal and convey the right information during the testing step? If not, then make sure you go back and adjust your prototype and consider doing an additional round of testing if you can prior to implementation. Remember that one general goal is to design a dashboard that will help the user be more efficient and find the information that they need. And to this end, it's important to include only what's necessary on your dashboard. And efficiency here is in terms of the user accessing the information they need in the easiest way possible. It's also important to go back to your problem statement that you made in the define step and your measures of success that you created there to ensure that the dashboard meets all the requirements, and go back to your empathy map and user needs and make sure that all of their needs are met, or at least almost all of them. Sometimes we're not going to meet every single need, but we can meet the majority of them. And after your design has been implemented, you want to add context and definitions to the dashboard. It's also important to do another round of testing. And internally within your team, make sure that you test all your filters and validate all your data points as well before you implement and do your final implementation. And externally with users, it's helpful to have users test the dashboard as well and provide kind of final feedback. And then you need to think about how you're going to communicate your dashboard and explain what has been built so the users can easily find the information that they need. So revisiting the definition of design thinking as well as the entire process, it's important to understand that these stages are different modes which contribute to the entire dashboard design project rather than sequential steps. As I mentioned earlier, you may move through these stages linearly, or you may move back and forth between them. And you might find during the ideate step that you need to go back and better understand the user and define the problem more clearly. There's certainly a lot of iteration between the prototype and testing stages. And after implementation, you want to go back to do a little bit more testing again too, before you release the final product. And your goal throughout this process is to gain the deepest understanding of the users and what their ideal solution or product would be. So next time I'm going to walk through a few examples from my department of different stages of design thinking and how we've used it. First is the University of Arizona Interactive Fact Book. This is a great example of the iterative process of design thinking. The Interactive Fact Book is our way of communicating university data to the public. It's hosted on my department's website and is available to anyone to access. It shows information about our students, faculty, and staff. And we've made continuous improvements to this tool. It began as a series of tables, which you're seeing on the left-hand side of this slide. And then we moved into some visualizations, which are in the middle of the slide. And there we've used default Tableau formatting and kind of some more basic graphs. And more recently, we've implemented our own department design system, and we've thought more critically about the best visualizations to convey the necessary information to our users. And so this whole process has really embodied the ideate, prototype, test, and implement stages of design thinking as we've gone through this annual stage of making improvements to the interactive fact book. It also considers user experience. So this, especially, well, in all of our tools, but especially with the Interactive Fact Book, we really try and think a lot about the user because this is a publicly available resource. And so by empathizing with our users and defining their use cases for this tool, we've created more simplified dashboards using consistent colors and fonts from our design system. We also separated the dashboards out into different sections to help with usability. So we have this before one on the left-hand side, which just had a line graph and a chart, again, with some of our default Tableau formatting. And then on the right-hand side, we have our updated version where we've implemented our design system. So we've used our own special, not special, because they're kind of just, they're publicly available fonts, but our own font structure. Our hierarchy of fonts really is the big thing, where we're using a specific type of font for the titles, and then a next level down for our headings, and next level down for graph titles and things like that. And then we also separated out, so we have a highlight section at the top and then kind of a details section at the bottom. So we show this one showing retention and graduation rates. So we show our current retention and graduation rates at the top, and then we show a line graph and a table at the bottom. So by separating it out, we think that that helps with usability to provide the users with multiple forms of the data. And we also improved accessibility by defining the focus order of our Tableau. These are all built in Tableau. So our Tableau dashboards, you can define the focus order so that users can navigate the dashboards in the correct order with a keyboard and a screen reader. Another set of dashboards that we've developed in my department is called Arizona Profiles, and this is an internal set of tools, and this also embodies several steps of the design thinking process. Across my whole department, there was a team, kind of all of the teams in my department that was involved with this project and collaborated with partners on campus to meet various needs of our users with this tool. So as I mentioned, it's an internal tool that provides a landing page for users in accessing university data. It provides more detailed information than the interactive fact book, and it also serves as a key portal for internal campus users. So on this slide, you can see one of the initial prototype designs, and this was created in Excel. And so one of the primary considerations in the design of Arizona Profiles was to provide the most important pieces of data in the upper left corner of the dashboard. And in the student headcount profile, which we're looking at here, the current undergraduate and graduate student counts are provided for the selected college or department. And then each of the following tiles provides a more breakdown of the metrics and trends on those important counts. And Arizona Profiles was also extensively tested by both users and internally within my department. And then each section of this tool, Arizona Profiles, also includes a reference guide to provide additional data literacy and definitions on the terms and data presented. And this is one way that the team empathized with the users of the tools and made sure that clear context was provided in the implementation. We also, on our interactive fact book, at the bottom of every dashboard, have a set of definitions to, again, help provide some of that context and data literacy. So in this workshop, you've learned about each stage or each step in the design thinking process and how it relates to the creation of a dashboard. I talked through how to complete each step in the process and associated some examples from the University of Arizona to different steps in the design thinking process. And I have one last little question for us here, and that is, let me get to the link, copy my link here. All right, so that is, what is your key takeaway from the workshop? So this should be an open-ended question that you can type in, and I'd love to hear some about your key takeaways from the workshop. As you're typing that in, I also just wanted to share, and before we go to questions, I just want to say thank you so much for attending this workshop. I really hope you found it helpful. So here is my email address at the University of Arizona, and I also, into the chat, I'm going to put links to my LinkedIn and also my Twitter account, and I would love to connect with you on there and get to chat with you more about dashboards, design thinking, data visualization, and data science. So let me go over to our key takeaways window here. Awesome. So we have empathy map. People like the empathy map, ideation process steps. Design thinking is customer user centric. So helpful and organized, great overview. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Ideas about how I can use the knowledge in my college projects. Yeah, this design thinking process can be used in any sort of dashboard project or anything like that. Reminder that design thinking is important to design of a dashboard as well as any other product. Great. Process of creating a dashboard rather than randomly throwing away stuff on the dashboard. Yes, I am very familiar with that step of randomly putting stuff on a dashboard, and the process does definitely help. Empathize with the users. Okay, I've used design thinking for project development and for creating dashboards. Awesome. I think these steps will help me better narrow down an approach to dashboard design and ask my team and stakeholders better questions. Yes, this idea of kind of asking questions of our stakeholders is really helpful. Ideation is critical. Don't fall in love with your first solution. Yep. All right. Thank you all so much. Thanks for putting these in here. And thank you so much for participating and being here today. And I'm going to stop my sharing so that we can get to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jen, for sharing your insights with us today. How would you characterize the approach used in the define stage? So is it more agile, so defined as a project moves along, or waterfall, define the project as much as possible at the beginning?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. So I think I think I would generally say more kind of waterfall in the sense, defining as much as possible at the beginning. I mean, certainly you learn things as the project goes along that then you might have to go back and implement, but as much as possible, if you can get as much as you can at the beginning, I think that's going to help, especially with a design thinking process like this, where you're kind of, I mean, as I said, it's not always sequential, but it definitely helps to have like a clear defined problem, as clear as possible at the beginning, before moving forward. Yeah, so I think as much as possible that start with your clear definition. That'll help.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. So this is helpful insight. And then we're going to move to the next question I see, which is, do you have any good resources or templates for tracking these steps for a dashboard project?
Yes, so we let me think. So I was going, we actually internally to my department, I mentioned this design system, and we built out a whole design system with, yes, the fonts and colors and all of that we should use, and some guidelines around what types of data visualizations work in different situations. But we also wrote out whole kind of templates for project briefs and things like that. What I will do, because I want to make sure we get to more questions that I answer here, I will in the chat before after we finish this live Q&A, I will go onto our page there, and I know that we have links to external resources that we use to create some of that, and I'll share some of those in the chat.
Okay, that is most helpful. And, just to point out, yes, some of the questions we may not get to live, but we can definitely do some follow-up afterwards. Okay,
yes.
Thank you. And here's a next question. So, any advice for being stuck in the empathy/define stage? Since the data is still new to me, so I find myself moving to prototype/the testing stage just to move back to empathy/define.
Yeah, so especially when you're kind of new to a project or new to the data, that's definitely going to happen where you move back and forth a bunch. I think it's a great idea to kind of do as much as you can in the empathy and define, and then yes, do move on to that prototype and test. And then you're going to find out, oh, I like kind of in the answer to the first question, like, oh, we missed this and we have to go back and figure that out. So I don't know that that's great advice, other than it sounds like you're doing the best that you can and a great job there in terms of, get all the information that you can, and then you're always going to find out a little bit more sometimes. And I guess another thing I would say there is, like, sometimes you might find out some more information that isn't, I mean, it could be important, but maybe it's not critical. And so sometimes you're learning things in the define stage, or in the testing phase. Maybe there's some feedback and you can tweak a little bit, but you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. So I think trying to kind of decide between whether things need to be, whether it's a piece of information that involves going all the way back to the beginning, or a piece of information that you can say, okay, like that's good to know for next time or for a later iteration. You can always kind of come back and do, like I showed with our interactive fact book, we definitely put stuff out there that then we went back to and updated. So that's an option too. You can sometimes just get something out that's the best that you can do at that moment, and then return to it later.
And also, would you say this also connects to the concept that you highlighted, that this is most definitely an iterative process?
Yes,
So
yeah, definitely.
that as well. Okay, perfect. Yeah. And let's see, I'm just checking time. We have time for a few more questions. And here's the next question. In the 4 broad categories of dashboards, where would a dashboard for a researcher who wants to obtain data themselves fall?
Yeah, I think that this one would be in that kind of analytical, that last one that I talked about, because if someone's trying to find the data themselves, then that really is that they're getting kind of deep into it. They might want some options to filter to a very specific set of data, or be able to add certain metrics. And in certain cases like that, then the dashboard might not have very many visual elements. It might be more of a set of tables or something like that someone can export. And sometimes we make dashboards that are like that. I mean, I certainly prefer to make dashboards that have a bunch of, well, maybe not a bunch, but like, nice graphs and charts and things like that. But sometimes we have to make ones that we have to make them for the user. And sometimes our users want to be able to download the data from the dashboard. And so then it's really understanding what values, like what metrics are important to them, and what kind of interactivity do they want? Like, do they want to be able to filter to certain sets, or do they just want everything? And then understanding the export piece. And if it is that they want everything, maybe a dashboard isn't the right solution. Maybe they need an Excel file or a spreadsheet or something like that. But broadly speaking, with that question, I think that would fall into that analytical type of dashboard.
Okay, and thank you. And we have a next question. I wanted to mention something about the empathy map at that stage, but you know what, we'll move on to the next question. So is there a difference between prototyping and system design / architecture?
Good question. I think they're related, certainly. I think broadly speaking, in terms of like the words themselves, like system design, I think does have a very kind of specific meaning.
Yeah.
But I do definitely think that they're related in terms of this idea of trying to figure out the best design for something and the best layout of the information for someone to interact with it and use it. So I think those are definitely related, although I think that the definitions of the terms are quite distinct.
Here's another question. So what are the main tools and/or software in each step of design thinking?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are a lot of options. But I think so for the early stages, like empathy and define. I mean, you can use something like a Word document or a Google Doc or something like that, like some sort of document where you can write out, the user's needs, how they're feeling, what they're thinking, and then the definitions of the problem definitions, like what are we trying to achieve, what does success look like, what metrics, kind of those answers to those user questions. Ideate could be, pen and paper. It could be on some sort of software tool. Prototyping, I think I mentioned a few tools there, like PowerPoint, Excel. Someone put in the chat Plotly. Other sorts of kind of any sort of like tool that you can draw in, basically, is an option for prototyping. And then testing, I think a main tool for that is kind of having a meeting, or and I guess in the ideate stage as well, you might have a meeting. Maybe actually throughout, you're going to have a lot of meetings, but but that's
Yeah, most definitely.
So you could collaborate and talk to people. But you can also do some testing through kind of email, right? You don't have to do it synchronously necessarily. And in that as well, you could send kind of images of the prototypes or PDFs of the prototypes. Again, they don't have to be ones that a prototype that someone can interact with. Then in implementation, what we use at my office is we use Tableau, and then we also use, what we use for our interactive fact book. And then for the Arizona profiles that I mentioned, we have an internal tool that we use, which is Oracle Business Intelligence Enterprise Edition. So we use an Oracle BI tool for our internal dashboards. Some others might be things like Power BI, Google Data Studio. Those are the ones that are coming to mind right now, but I know that some people even build dashboards in Excel. And so there's a lot of different tools out there for that implementation step. Or you can also use kind of programming languages to create, either like JavaScript and D3 can be used to create web-based ones, or you can use R to create reports or Shiny apps or things like that. So there's lots of tools.
Absolutely. And, just to connect this theme of tools, I will get back to this previous question, but it's a related question. So what data tools do you use in the background for the dashboards? Are Python, or are there others?
Yeah, so we use SQL. SQL is the data tool that we use. We are very Oracle based, so we also have an Oracle data warehouse. My department manages the enterprise data warehouse for the entire university, which houses basically all of the university's data. And that's an Oracle based database. And so we are using that primarily. I do in my work as well use R primarily too, but not so much for the dashboards, kind of for my other data science work. But yeah, for data tools for the dashboards, we're using a lot of SQL.
Okay, and I see that we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So this next question that I'm seeing, and I'll try to get back to that other question. Do you have any suggestions on how we can use an empathy map with executives who are not clear in terms of what they want?
This is a very good question and a very challenging question. I think this is one place where I do think actually prototyping can be helpful. And I know I said that like you want to understand your users and your problem, but if you're having trouble with understanding clearly what people want, a prototype can be a way to take the information that you do have and create a really quick kind of view of what it would look like and what metrics would be included. And sometimes getting something visual in front of people can help them see, oh, this is what I want, or no, that's not what I want. I wanted this. And so that might be a way to do it, is get some information. And then the advantage of prototypes is that they can be made very quickly. And so, and they don't have to be, your final, you're not trying to get the real data in and make all the graphs. You're just kind of sketching out what would be there. And so it can be a way to create something that then you can get in front of people quite quickly and get an idea of, is this what you want? And that can help in the define stage. And there, maybe you would kind of skip or only very briefly do the ideate step and go straight to the prototype step, and then go back to that empathy and define steps to kind of cycle through that a little bit, and then help you really clearly define the problem. And then you can get more into brainstorming that.
Okay, and I'm going to try to ask one more question. So, and we may have to kind of get creative with timing. So what's the difference between an MVP in this case, based on the design thinking process versus iterating by creating multiple MVPs and having the client vote on their favorites?
Yeah, so I'm thinking here MVP is a minimum viable product. That's what I'm thinking.
That's what I
So yeah, I think that is, let's see, what's the difference between an MVP and a based on design versus iterating by creating multiple? I don't know that there is, I'm not sure that there is much difference there, but I do understand that there's this idea about how long it takes to create multiple kind of prototypes and how long it might take to get feedback on that. And so, and you don't, and there's another part of this question too about moving forward with a favorite helps the client get out of a continuous cycle of improvement, which is true. You don't want to be in this endless cycle of iterating and improving. I think it depends on the situation, right? If you know your users and you know that if you give them lots of options, then you're just going to get into this cycle of, well, what about this and this and this? Then maybe don't do that. You don't have to give them multiple options, but I do think it's a good idea to at least do one prototype or one minimum viable product so that you can get some early feedback before you dive into doing all of the implementation. So I think it depends on the situations and how much time you have. Maybe, again, like this is a process that does take some time. And so sometimes you might need to, cut back on some of the steps in order to save your time there. And that's okay. Sometimes you can't do every step. But it's, again, I think the main thing is making sure you're thinking about the user and keeping the end goals in mind. And as much as possible doing this kind of feedback loop process. So I see we've got a couple more questions here. I think that I can type answers to them. So
yes,
I'll do that. And then I will also look up some links and share them in the chat with you all. And thank you so much. This was really, really fun and I really enjoyed it.